Hello guys, welcome back to episode number 9 of Shraga Debunks. This is the segment in which I take anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist, or anti-Israeli propaganda and, well, debunk it. Today we're going to be talking about the big one. I know I say it all the time, but this time I really mean it. The big one, that Israel targets Palestinian civilians. We've all heard it before, let's get to it. So, I'm sure you've all heard it before. Israel's targeting civilians. These poor Palestinian civilians are being targeted by Israel. Israel, as a matter of policy, targets civilians. Well, let's question the narrative. First, I want to make it very clear so I don't get accused of it later. In no way do I condone the loss of life. Okay, the loss of life is a terrible thing. Even were the head of Hamas to drop dead tomorrow morning, I would still be sad because of the loss of life, no matter how necessary or how deserved it was. Okay? The loss of life is a bad thing. Okay? Inherently, in and of itself, any human life lost is bad. Okay? Any human life. There we go. That's out the way. Now let's get on to the specifics of this case. Obviously, let's start with the obvious statement: Israel doesn't target civilians. Okay? Israel does not attack innocent civilians. We don't condone the loss of life. We're not in favor of killing innocent people. How do I know this? Well, let's take a look at the facts. Okay? So, for example, there was a soldier called Elo Azaria. This happened about a year ago. He shot a terrorist dead. This was a terrorist that had just killed his friend, but he had been captured by him. He shot him dead after he had already been subdued. Elo Azaria got put in prison for it. And there was this whole national discussion of whether what he did was okay or not. And if there's a whole national discussion about whether shooting a terrorist who had just killed his friend is okay or not, do you think there's even room in a country like that for someone to say, I'm going to target civilians? Does that make sense? Israel in no way wants to target civilians. It's a civilian army that we have. Our army is made up of people just like me, just like my friends, just like people who aren't my friends, who just go to the army to defend our country. None of us want to target civilians because we are civilians. There are Arabs in the army too. They're not forced to be there. We are. But they're still civilians. We have civilians in the army. The army is a civilian army, and we have no interest in targeting civilians. Now, about bombing civilians, in Gaza or the West Bank or wherever we seem to be bombing now. Tell you what Israel does to avoid bombing civilians. We actually call up the location that's going to be bombed. We call them up and tell them we're about to drop a bomb. If we're going to drop a bomb in a civilian area, let me repeat myself, we give them a phone call saying, hey, we're going to bomb you guys. Yeah, guys, you might want to get out there because we're going to bomb in about 2 minutes. Yeah, so just get your stuff and go. Yep, okay. That's what we do. More than that, as if we needed to do more. What we do is we drop flyers and leaflets, just in case, they don't get the phone call. Okay, they don't pick up. We drop flyers and leaflets in the streets to avoid civilians getting hurt. More than that, because Israel's like that. What do? We drop a warning shot. Okay, this practice is called roof knocking. Okay, hakesh bagag. It's called roof knocking because we just drop a non-explosive charge on the roof to let them know that there's about to be an explosion in that area. That's 3 measures we take to avoid civilian loss of life in a bombing. Okay, no other army on the planet, not a single other army on the planet does this. All that being said, how is it even possible that civilians get hurt? How does that make sense? If we give them warning, right, how does it make sense that civilians get hurt? How does that even happen? I'll tell you how. Hamas tells their civilians to human shield. Okay, to use themselves as human shields in order to avoid areas getting bombed. Why is that true? Because Israel often calls off attacks when civilians stay there. I'll give you some evidence of this, so it's not just a claim I'm making. When Hamas spokesman Sami Abu Zuri was interviewed, he called on the Palestinian people to use the human shield tactic to defend their homes. We in the Hamas movement call on our people to adopt this procedure. That's human shielding. Hamas's Ministry of Interior has issued an official announcement to the residents of the Gaza Strip, telling them not to pay attention to IDF's announcements about vacating their homes. The announcement calls on our dear residents to reject these messages, not to vacate their homes, and conduct themselves calmly. They tell them not to vacate their homes, but to stay in place and be bombed. Wonder why there's so many casualties. Look at this flyer. I'm going to bring it up right here. That flyer is Hamas telling their civilians to stay on the roofs. If you take a look, there's a bunch of people on those roofs, and there are a bunch of bombs coming down there. And these people are staying on the roof. And the caption, it says, "Stay strong," or "People who are strong," or it's Anashim Eitani is a translation in Hebrew, so it would be strong people, or brave, or courageous, or all these good things that people want to be associated with. Why do you think that is? Because Hamas wants their civilians to get hurt, so they can use it as propaganda against Israel. Okay? All of this is good and nice and everything, but why does Israel even bomb a civilian area? Why does Israel have to warn civilians to get out of the way? Right? If Israel didn't bomb civilian areas, there wouldn't be any problems. No. And I'll tell you why. Civilian areas is exactly where Hamas hides their weapons. They literally hide missiles under schools, hospitals, and just civilian areas. They hide bomb caches. They hide all these military weaponry in civilian areas. Why? So that Israel doesn't bomb it. So that Israel doesn't... If Hamas made a military base, let's imagine tomorrow Hamas comes out and says, we're making a military base right over here. That military base would not survive the week. It would not survive like 3 hours. So, what they do is they hide their weapons in civilian areas. This is why there are civilian casualties. Now, in retaliation to these guerrilla warfare attacks, Israel says clearly, we say, please don't do that. And if you do, we're going to warn the people to get out. And then Hamas says, okay, you're going to warn the people to get out. What we're going to do is we're going to tell them to stay there and do human shielding, and we'll just use the religion that we have to back it up. That's what they do. And that's why civilians get hurt. Israel does everything we can to avoid civilian deaths. We've called off multiple strikes because civilians are still there. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes we do it anyway. Sometimes we prioritize our own civilians over their civilians. Hamas, there's a good graphic about this. Israel has soldiers defending the lives of civilians. Hamas has civilians defending the lives of soldiers. They have their soldiers hide behind women and children and, well, people who are civilians. And Israel has a civilian army, right, of people like me, I'm going to be going in next year, who are just standing in front of the civilians that we have. And we say, you know what? No, you're not going to get to kill our civilians. We're going to defend ourselves. Now, all of this is true. What happens when Hamas doesn't actually have anyone dead that they want to claim? Israel sometimes fails to bomb places. Israel sometimes doesn't actually kill anyone. And Hamas, that really annoys them. Okay, that makes Hamas so upset that Israel hasn't killed anyone. So what do? Well, I'll tell you what they do. They use this thing called Pallywood. Have you heard of it? Let me explain. They have these fake videos of Palestinians pretending to be under fire, pretending to be shot, pretending to be hurt and injured and killed. And, well, there's just all this fake drama. It's called Pallywood, like Palestinian Hollywood. That's what happens. A lot of the videos that you see on the news, some of them are actually fake. I'll link them in the description below with good explanations of why they're fake. But Hamas fake videos in order to make themselves look better. In order to make Israel look like an aggressor. But if you watch the videos with a critical mind, instead of falling for the emotional manipulation that Hamas uses, you'll see that the videos don't actually make any sense. Often they have people running towards a position and running away from a position and running back towards it, then running across. Someone's carrying the guy across the street, then someone else comes along and they go across the street again. Right? This would be supposedly under fire. They'd be going crossing the street back and forth. That doesn't make any sense to me. There's all these fake videos of Hamas faking dead people in order to blame Israel for this. And these aren't just fake videos that are going around the internet, which is hugely influential, but it's also just these people. They give the videos to the news, and the news uses that. Okay? Sometimes there's Palestinians just walking along, and then they start joining in, or the Palestinians just not joining in, just they keep on walking, even though they're supposedly under fire. All of this is in order to make Israel look like an evil, oppressive regime, which we are not. Israel guarantees equality of rights. We are a democracy. Our army does not act unless it has to. It is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. That's how it is. Israel doesn't target civilians, and we never want to target civilians. We are a free democratic state In fact, we're so democratic that we even had 4 elections in the last year. Okay, that's how democratic we are. We don't even have a government at the moment, but that's beside the point. The army doesn't act in order to harm civilians. The army acts in defense only. The army is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and that's its goal, and that's its only purpose. Now, obviously, the army makes mistakes. It's guerrilla warfare. It's intended to make mistakes. Okay? The guerrilla warfare tactics employed by Hamas are intended to make us make mistakes. And we do make mistakes. And every single loss of life is a tragedy. Again, every human life is equally valuable, and they do not want anyone to get hurt. But when they're targeting our civilians, it is time to enact defensive measures against their warriors. And because these warriors hide behind their civilians, it's going to happen that people are going to get hurt. We're doing everything we can, but there's only so much we can do. Let's compare this for a second to Hamas. What does Hamas do? Hamas openly call for jihad, the policy of killing everyone who's not Muslim. They advocate for the destruction of Israel and the establishment of a state of Palestine in all of Israel. They blow up schools, houses, target civilians, they stab teachers, they kill innocent people as a matter of policy. That's Hamas. Okay, they target civilians. Their rockets are not aimed at our military bases, they're aimed at our cities. Okay, the explosions that happened a couple of weeks ago, those happened in civilian areas. Okay, there's the ancient city was under attack from riots. And they just target civilians. And Israel gets, all the blame for targeting civilians, which Israel doesn't do. Well, Hamas is allowed to just do whatever they want. They're an openly terrorist, openly jihadist Islamic terror group. And what do they get? Nothing but praise from the rest of the world. Well, there's some people who are Zionists in the rest of the world, but mostly praise from, the human rights organizations. One last myth that's connected to this, but not really connected to this, is the claim of, Israel demolishes Palestinian villages. Okay, it's even a card against humanity. It's all these things that Israel demolishes Palestinian villages because Israel wants to settle that area and the villages are too close or something. That's not true. That's just not true. Okay? Take a look recently. The most recent village that was destroyed was 73 Bedouins. That's people right there. 73 Bedouin people, that's like 4 or 5 houses, 10 maximum. That wasn't that many houses. And I'll tell you why it was demolished. Not because they're Arab, not because they're Palestinian, not because they're Bedouin, but because they're built without a permit. Okay? When you build in a country that requires a permit, and you build without a permit, your house is going to get knocked down by the same country in which you built. Okay? Now, personally, I think you shouldn't have to do that. I think that as soon as you own the land, you should be able to do whatever you want with the land. Okay? But that's not how Israel works, and it's not how most countries in the world work. Okay? Now, regardless of whether that policy is legitimate or not, it doesn't matter because I'm pointing out that it's not racist and it's not this apartheid thing like I spoke about a couple of episodes ago. Israel doesn't demolish the village because it was Palestinian. They demolished a few houses because they had no permits to build there. Okay, that happens with Jewish houses too. Okay, if you want to take a look when Israel destroyed a bunch of things based on race, take a look at Gush Katif. Okay, Gush Katif and the whole Gaza Strip was full of Israeli settlements. Israeli people living there. Israeli towns, cities even. And Israel demolished the entire area to allow Arabs to have it. Okay, that's pretty much the only time I can remember of that happening. And what do we get in return? A bunch of missiles. Well, I hope I've successfully debunked the myth that Israel targets civilians and demolishes villages. If you have any ideas, write them in the comments down below. If you have any comments or anything to say that's not really, really rude, you can write it in the comments down below. Even if it is rude, I'll take it. And yeah, like, share, subscribe, share the truth, and as always, I'm Israel Chai.